Announcement came barely 24 hours after U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry said exactly the same thing, but was quickly denied by the State Department. As Phil Black explains, Moscow's plan has received support from Iran, China, and even the Arab League.
He's using slightly different language to what he was using yesterday. Christie, only slightly. Today he's saying that Syria has agreed to this plan. Yesterday they said they had welcomed the plan. They'd basically signed on, really, not long after it was endorsed and suggested very strongly by the Russian government here. So this idea, which seems to have been born from these off-the-cuff comments by Secretary Kerry, have now been accepted, endorsed by Russia, by Syria. The rest of the world is approaching this now with some cautious optimism. But it must now make the next big step from being an idea to being a reality. The international community has to decide politically what the ground rules are for deciding how this will work, how it will be enforced and so forth. But in many ways more challenging than that, there has to be a practical plan on the ground for identifying, accounting for, and then ultimately securing Syria's highly secretive chemical weapons program in the context of an ongoing civil war. It is a big job, and it is not going to happen within the next 7 days, as Secretary Kerry remarked initially yesterday. But Russia says it is now performing the job of coming together with a plan, putting together a credible plan to move forward with Syria. This is what the Russian Foreign Minister said on this just this morning.
We are currently engaged in the preparation of a workable, clear, specific plan for which, literally this minute, we're in contact with the Syrian side. We expect to present this plan in the near future and are prepared to refine and work it out with the participation of the UN Secretary General, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and with the participation of the members of the Security Council.
Now, Christie, the international reaction to this initiative from other countries, including the United States, has been to some degree, at least potentially positive, but as I say, very cautious as well. In almost every case, it has been qualified by remarks that suggest this should not be allowed to become a time-wasting exercise, some sort of delaying mechanism for simply putting off US and allied military action. So whatever plan the Russians and the Syrians now come up with, it's going to have to be strong enough, specific enough, credible enough to deal with that sort of skepticism. Christie.
Now, France seems to be putting the Russian plan to the test.
Well, meanwhile, as the international community continues to debate on how to tackle the Syrian situation, fighting continues in Damascus. Opposition groups say the shelling is still ongoing as the death toll continues to rise, and they also accuse the Assad regime of trying to buy time to avoid U.S. attacks, but it will not surrender its weapons to the international community. CNN's Nick Robertson explains from Beirut.
Regime at the moment. For the regime, this does come as a welcome way to avoid, at least in the short term, those U.S. military strikes that were really hanging over their head, had them moving troops out of barracks into schools, moving weapons around. So clearly the regime was very concerned, but now they've said they've agreed to this Russian plan, this Russian proposal. But for the rebels, it is much more troubling than that. They really do feel that this is a stalling tactic by the regime. They also say, how can the West trust Bashar al-Assad to turn over his stockpiles? The stockpiles are believed to be large. They're believed to be dispersed in many locations around the country. And the rebels question whether or not the United States or the UN or whomever was involved in inspecting and collecting those weapons would ever get to the bottom of the stockpile, would ever get them all. And the rebels also say, for that matter, the fighting continues. The conventional weapons are still in use. The killing by conventional shelling rather than chemical weapons, that's going on to this day. So really there is deep concern and skepticism by the rebels, who really feel that Bashar al-Assad is trying to dodge the bullet by way of US missiles and play for time and try to take more ground in the country. Christie.
You know, the rebels raise a legitimate point, the practical matter of actually carrying out this Russian proposal. Syria may have agreed to give up control of its stockpile, but how can that be carried out in the middle of a civil war? What are the steps that need to take place?
They're huge, and given where we are right now, diplomatically, politically, internationally, given where we've seen the British public, by virtue of the MPs in Britain, voting down Prime Minister Cameron's resolution to move or inch towards, not even back, the US strikes, and given that the Congress in the United States is still sort of wavering on this issue, the political will that would be required for what diplomats have described to me as a massive peacekeeping force that could potentially be required in a situation like this of up to 200,000 boots on the ground. That force alone would be what they say what would be required to stabilize, secure the situation, to allow an environment where these chemical weapons experts could get into the country and begin to secure the weapons. And even that, chemical weapons experts say, is a massive project in itself. The need to secure locations, to incinerate the chemicals, doesn't happen quickly. You need a lot of experts, perhaps tens of thousands dedicated to these multiple sites around the country. So it would be, in the very least, a long process without even the first of the most significant steps really being taken. This is something that's in discussion, is barely being committed to paper at this time, let alone to find the resources and the international commitment to make it happen from where we stand. The bottom line is, there is no ceasefire, there is no peace in Syria at the moment. How can there be an agreement when the regime is for it and the rebels are against it, to get the chemical weapons experts in the country, Christy?
Well, 4 men have been found guilty in the gang rape and murder of a 23-year-old woman in New Delhi last year. She was attacked in a bus in a crime that shocked the entire nation, and she later died from her injuries, sparking nationwide protest across India. Her father is calling for the death penalty, whilst lawyers say they will appeal the verdict. CNN's Malika Kapoor was there, and she brings us the latest.
The entire nation was thinking about what would happen in the courtroom today. The focus of the entire country was inside that courtroom, and the verdict went exactly as the public had hoped it would go. All the 4 accused today were convicted. They were found guilty on all charges related to the gang rape of that young student here in New Delhi last year in December. They were found guilty of gang rape, unnatural offences, destruction of evidence, kidnapping, and murder of the helpless victim. As I said earlier, it was a packed courtroom, and amongst the people in the courtroom was the victim's family. Her parents were there, and her brother was there. They had tears in their eyes as the judge read out the verdict, and her brother was seen wiping a tear from his cheek. Very moving scenes inside that packed courtroom today. Soon after the verdict was announced, the defense team, though, sprung into action. They did have comments to make. They said that they will appeal the case in a higher court. And the defense lawyers, one of them said that the verdict was a result of government pressure, and the accused had neither money nor muscle power to fight for a fair trial. After that, when the 4 convicted rapists were led away from the courthouse, they were taken away amongst heavy security in a police van. One of them was heard shouting some really intense abuses, the choicest of abuses at media who were there surrounding the courthouse. That's another detail we got from outside the courtroom today. But all in all, the verdict went exactly as the public had hoped for. Christy?
And very emotional scenes inside the courtroom. Now, this was supposed to be a fast-track court. So, Malika, why did it take so long for the verdict to come out?
That's right. It was supposed to be a fast-track court. It took about 7 months. The trial began in February this year. And Christy, for India, remember, 7 months is not long at all. Judicial cases here, the judiciary can drag it out for months, even for several years. So for this case to be completed within 7 months is actually a small victory for the judicial system. So 7 months here is being seen as a very good thing. It's a sign that the fast track has worked. And now the public is hoping that the case will reach its logical conclusion tomorrow when the sentencing is announced. And overwhelmingly here in India, the public opinion is that this kind of crime calls for capital punishment.
Well, time now to join the Weather Center for the day's weather outlook.
source assures us of a